Preface. The work entitled History of the Jews, composed by Heinrich Graetz, opens with a declaration shaped by both purpose and conviction, a statement directed toward a new audience beyond its original language. The author expresses a distinct satisfaction that his extensive historical study, originally titled The History of the Jews, from the earliest times to the present day, has been made accessible to those who read the English language. This transformation is not merely a change of words, but a deliberate effort to bring a long and complex historical account into a form that can be readily understood, held, and engaged with by readers in societies where books are not only collected but actively read, considered, and allowed to influence thought and conduct. Graetz places particular emphasis on the character of English-speaking societies, observing that such audiences have historically demonstrated an ability to recognize and appreciate the distinct identity of the Jewish people. It is his expectation that, through exposure to the unfolding narrative of Jewish history with its alternating moments of elevation and suffering, readers will develop a deeper sense of understanding and sympathy. The account he presents is not a simple record of events, but a continuous movement between triumph and adversity, a pattern that defines the experience of the people across long stretches of time. He then turns to the familiarity that many English readers already possess with figures drawn from ancient tradition, including the patriarchs, who are regarded as the founding ancestors of the Jewish people, as well as heroes and individuals described as men of God, figures associated with divine purpose and moral leadership. Because these figures are already known within broader religious and cultural traditions, Greed suggests that readers are in a position to grasp more fully what he describes as a remarkable historical phenomenon. This phenomenon is the enduring continuity of the Jewish people over a span of approximately 3,000 years. This continuity, he explains, stands as something extraordinary even for those who reject the idea of miracles. Such individuals, who interpret events strictly through natural causes and logical sequences, may still find it difficult to overlook the persistence of the people who have survived conditions that would typically lead to disappearance or assimilation. The author frames this endurance as a phenomenon that appears to exist in defiance of ordinary expectations, developing and sustaining itself despite forces that might have prevented its continuation. At the same time, Graetz highlights the influence of Jewish culture, noting that it has exerted a significant effect on the broader development of nations. This influence has persisted despite what he describes as intense and prolonged hostility directed toward those who carried and preserved that culture. In his view, the Jewish people have not only survived but have also contributed in meaningful ways to the intellectual and moral structure of the societies around them. The intention behind presenting this history in English is then made explicit. Graetz expresses a hope that the work will help reduce hostility directed toward the Jewish people. He envisions a future in which their distinct role, shaped through centuries of historical experience and hardship, is acknowledged rather than resented. He speaks of a peculiar sphere, meaning a unique place or function that has been formed through long historical processes, and he argues that this role should be allowed to exist without obstruction. The author's aspiration is that the Jewish people may be permitted to carry out what he describes as their appointed mission, a purpose defined by their historical journey, without interference or opposition. The structure of the English edition is also carefully explained. Rather than presenting a shortened selection or summary, this version represents a condensed but complete reproduction of the original German work, which consists of 11 volumes. The English edition is arranged into 5 volumes, preserving the overall scope while reducing its size for accessibility. However, one significant change has been made. The detailed footnotes included in the original have been omitted. This decision is intended to make the work less extensive and more approachable for general readers, while those engaged in deeper historical study are expected to consult the original German text, where such notes remain available. Graetz further notes that the English version extends its historical coverage beyond that of the original publication. While the German edition concluded with the events of the year 1848, a period marked by widespread political upheaval across Europe, the English translation continues the narrative up to the year 1870. This extension ensures that readers are presented with a more current account of developments leading into the later 19th century. The final volume, he explains, will provide a comprehensive overview of the entire historical journey of the Jewish people, accompanied by an index that organizes names and events for reference. Before concluding his preface, Graetz expresses gratitude toward an individual who played a crucial role in bringing the translation into existence. He refers to Frederick David Makata, describing him as a figure devoted to supporting intellectual and humanitarian efforts with notable generosity. By calling him the patron, or benefactor, of the work, Graetz acknowledges that without such support, the translation and publication might not have been realized. He also remarks that Makata's name is widely recognized within Jewish communities, indicating his established reputation and influence. The preface is followed by additional remarks from the translator, Bella Lorwe, who clarifies her role in the production of the English edition. She explains that she personally translated the first volume up to the historical period associated with the Hasmoneans, a ruling family that emerged during the 2nd century before the Common Era. The remaining volumes, however, were translated by multiple contributors. Lorwe then undertook the task of revising and editing these contributions, ensuring consistency and accuracy throughout the work. She also expresses her thanks to Israel Abrahams, a scholar whose expertise assisted in addressing the complexities associated with Hebrew language terms and Jewish-specific terminology. These elements often present challenges in translation, requiring careful attention to preserve their meaning while making them understandable to readers unfamiliar with the original language. Finally, a brief statement from the publication committee addresses a delay in the release of the work. This delay, attributed to necessary revisions carried out by editors in the United States, postponed publication beyond the originally announced date. The committee expresses the hope that such delays will not occur in future volumes, indicating an intention to maintain a more consistent schedule moving forward. The opening chapter presents the earliest period of the Jewish people, beginning with the land of Canaan and its first known inhabitants, including powerful and imposing groups such as the Anakim and the Rephaim, who were remembered as giants. Alongside them lived the Phoenicians, a people known for trade and settlement along the coast. Into the setting emerges the claim of the Israelites to the land, rooted in the traditions of the patriarchs' early ancestral figures whose legacy shaped the identity and laws of the people. These traditions included systems of hereditary law that governed family and tribal continuity. Over time, circumstances led to the migration of these groups into Egypt, where they developed into a more unified tribal body. Life in Egypt is described as having both favorable and oppressive aspects, setting the stage for the rise of key leaders, Moses, his brother Aaron, and their sister Miriam. Moses stands out as a prophetic figure, called to deliver his people from bondage despite resistance and doubt. This struggle leads to the dramatic departure known as the Exodus, marked by the crossing of the Red Sea and a long period of wandering in the desert. During this time, a defining moment occurs at Mount Sinai, where the people receive divine revelation, including the Decalogue, or Ten Commandments. However, the journey is not without setbacks, as moments of disobedience and compromise create internal crises. The narrative continues with prolonged wanderings, eventually leading to conflicts and victories over groups inhabiting regions east of the Jordan River. During this period, early forms of Hebrew poetry begin to take shape, reflecting the experiences and beliefs of the people. The chapter concludes with the death of Moses, closing a foundational era in the history of Israel. On a day in the season of spring, a time associated with renewal and movement among pastoral peoples, groups of shepherd tribes advanced toward and crossed the river known as the Jordan River. This river formed a natural boundary, and beyond it stretched a narrow yet significant territory lying along the eastern edge of the great inland sea called the Mediterranean Sea. The land into which these tribes entered was known in ancient times as Canaan, a name later replaced in common usage by Palestine. This moment, the passage across the Jordan and the settlement in this coastal land, would in time be understood as one of the most consequential movements in human history. At that time, however, it appeared as nothing more than the migration of nomadic herdsmen seeking pasture and stability. There was no clear sign to distant nations, nor even to the inhabitants already living within that territory, that this arrival would shape religious, cultural, and historical developments for generations to come. The land itself, though limited in size, would become the stage upon which events of lasting importance unfolded. Over many centuries, the region came to be regarded with deep reverence, eventually earning the title of the Holy Land. This designation reflected not its geography alone, but the profound influence of the people who settled there and the traditions that would arise from their presence. At the time of this early movement, the surrounding populations, as well as distant civilizations, lacked any awareness of the long-reaching consequences tied to this migration. The tribes who crossed into Canaan, later identified as Hebrews or Israelites, did not enter a place of immediate recognition or acknowledgement. Instead, their arrival passed largely unnoticed in the broader scope of the ancient world, even though it would later be understood as the beginning of a transformation whose effects would extend far beyond the boundaries of the narrow strip of land. At the period when the people later known as the Hebrews, also called Israelites, came to occupy this land, it was far from empty. It was already inhabited by various tribes and peoples, each distinct in origin, in way of life, and in purpose. Among these, the foremost place was held by the earliest inhabitants, the aboriginal groups known as the Anakim and the Rephaim. These were remembered in tradition as a race of extraordinary physical power, described as giants whose presence inspired fear and awe. Ancient accounts portrayed them as descendants of a rebellious and overbearing race from the earliest times, a people who had once attempted to rise against divine authority itself, even to the point of storming the heavens. For this act of defiance, they were said to have been condemned to destruction and disgrace. Their later descendants, still formidable in stature and strength, came to be known among certain ancient nations as the Emim, a name meaning terrible men, reflecting the fear they inspired. Yet despite their imposing appearance and reputation, these powerful inhabitants could not maintain their hold on the land. They were overcome and displaced by other groups who were physically smaller and less imposing. Those who survived were forced to retreat, migrating toward regions east of the Jordan River, as well as to the southern and southwestern areas beyond it. A remnant of these Anakim remained, and their presence would later strike deep fear into the hearts of the Israelite scouts sent to survey the land. These scouts, upon encountering such figures, returned overwhelmed with dread. Their report spread despair among their people, convincing the entire community that the land could never be conquered. This fear became expressed in a saying, "Who could stand before the children of Anak?" The scouts described their own insignificance in comparison, saying that they appeared like grasshoppers beside these giants, and believed they were seen in the same way by them. Despite this overwhelming fear, these very giants would in time be overcome by the Israelites, who were far less imposing in physical stature. Alongside these ancient inhabitants, another significant group had established itself in the region between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. These were the Canaanites, a people whom later Greek writers referred to as the Phoenicians. Unlike the earlier inhabitants known for their physical power, the Phoenicians distinguished themselves through skill, adaptability, and enterprise. They had likely migrated from regions near the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, and in their new homeland they continued the pursuits that had defined them before, navigation and trade. The location they chose was exceptionally well suited for such activities. The Mediterranean Sea reached its western extent toward a narrow passage known in later times as the Pillars of Hercules, marking the boundary between Europe and Africa. Along the eastern coastline, at the base of the mountain range called Mount Lebanon and its surrounding ridges, there existed natural inlets and harbors. These required little modification and provided safe and convenient bases for maritime activity. On this coastline, the Canaanites established important urban centers. Among the earliest was Sidon, built upon a rocky height overlooking the sea. Later, they constructed the city of Tyre on a small offshore island, a location that would become famous for its strength and commercial power. To the north of Sidon, they built Aradus, and to the south of Tyre, they established Acco. The surrounding natural resources contributed greatly to their success. The forests of the Lebanon and the neighboring anti-Lebanon mountains provided tall cedar trees and durable cypress wood, ideal for constructing ships. These materials supported their expansion across the seas and enabled them to become one of the earliest and most influential trading nations in the world. Their prosperity was further enhanced by resources found along their coastline. Among these were various species of a sea creature known as the murex, from which they extracted a rich and highly valued purple dye. This dye became renowned throughout the ancient world. In addition, near the river called the Belus, close to Acco, there existed fine white sand suitable for the production of glass, another commodity in great demand. The wealth of the region, therefore, did not lie in vast lands or agricultural abundance alone, but in the unique resources of its shores and the ingenuity of its people. Through extensive trade with distant lands, the Canaanites came into contact with many different nations, gradually drawing them into networks of exchange and interaction. To support their commercial activities, they developed and introduced an early system of writing, known as the Phoenician alphabet. This system proved so practical and efficient that it became the foundation upon which many later alphabets, both ancient and modern, were built. Within this region, the population was not unified under a single identity but divided into smaller groups or nationalities. These included the Amorites, the Hittites, the Hivites, and the Perizzites. Another group, the Jebusites, occupied a particular area that would later become the site of the city known as Jerusalem, though at this time they held only limited influence. Of even lesser significance were the Girgashites, a group without a permanent settlement. All of these names, and the peoples they represent, might have faded entirely from memory had it not been for the arrival of the Israelites into this land, an event that brought these groups into the unfolding record of history. The people who crossed into the land of Canaan did not come merely as wanderers in search of pasture for their flocks. Their purpose was far greater, rooted not only in present need but in memory, tradition, and a deeply held sense of inheritance. They believed that this land was not new to them, but already belonged to them by right. It was, in their understanding, the land of their forefathers, the place where those who had come before them had lived, built, and been laid to rest. At the center of this belief stood the figure of Abraham, regarded as the first patriarch, meaning the founding father of their people. He had come from a region called Aram, located near the great river known as the Euphrates, one of the major rivers of the ancient Near East. From there, he had journeyed across lands, moving from place to place, until he settled for a time in the region of Hebron, a significant settlement within Canaan. There, he made a lasting claim upon the land by purchasing a burial site, known as the Cave of Machpelah, which means the double cave. This was not simply a place of rest for the dead, it was a permanent mark of ownership, a declaration that his family belonged to that land. In that burial place, Abraham laid to rest his wife Sarah, and later he himself was buried there. After him, his son Isaac, the second patriarch, was also placed within the same tomb. Thus, the cave became more than a grave, it became a symbol of continuity, a physical link between generations, binding the people to the land through the memory of their ancestors. The third patriarch, Jacob, continued this connection. His life was marked by struggle and movement, yet he too secured a claim within the land. Near the city of Shechem, which lay in a central and strategically important position within the territory inhabited by a group known as the Hivites, Jacob acquired a piece of land. The city was not taken peacefully. Its possession came after conflict, which arose from a grave offense against his family, when his daughter was abducted and dishonored. In response, Jacob and his sons acted decisively, and the city came under their control. This act, remembered in tradition, reinforced the idea that their presence in the land was not accidental, but established through both purchase and struggle. Despite this connection, circumstances forced Jacob to leave the land. A severe famine, meaning a widespread shortage of food, made survival difficult. Hearing that there was grain available in the land of Egypt, a powerful kingdom to the southwest, Jacob and his family traveled there to sustain themselves. Yet even as he approached death in a foreign land, Jacob did not abandon his claim to Canaan. On his deathbed, he gave a clear and solemn command to his sons: his body must not remain in Egypt. Instead, it was to be carried back and buried in the family tomb, the Cave of Machpelah, alongside his forefathers. This instruction revealed the depth of his attachment to the land and reinforced the belief that their true home remained there. The land of Canaan held not only the graves of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but also the altars they had built. These altars were places of worship, constructed in different locations to honor the deity they believed in. This deity was understood as a single, supreme God, distinct from the many gods worshipped by surrounding nations. The presence of these altars across the land served as further evidence, in the minds of the Israelites, that their ancestors had established a lasting and sacred connection to the territory. From these memories and traditions grew a powerful conviction. The Israelites believed that their claim to the land was not only historical but also spiritual. According to the teachings passed down from the patriarchs, the God they worshipped had promised this land to them. These promises, it was said, were revealed in visions, clear and repeated assurances given to their ancestors. The purpose of this promise was not merely to grant them possession, but to guide them toward a higher way of life. This higher way was centered on a new understanding of the divine. Unlike other nations, which represented their gods through images and physical forms, often made of stone or metal, the patriarchs taught belief in one God who could not be confined to such representations. This belief rejected what they saw as empty or mistaken ideas about divine power. Instead, it emphasized a more refined and thoughtful understanding of the nature of God. From this belief flowed a moral expectation. The descendants of Abraham were to live according to principles of justice and fairness, treating others with righteousness in contrast to the widespread injustice that characterized many societies of that time. This way of living was described as the way of God, a path that combined belief with ethical conduct. It was not meant to remain with one generation alone, but to be passed down within families, taught from parent to child as a sacred duty. Alongside this responsibility came another promise. It was believed that through the descendants of the patriarchs, this knowledge and way of life would eventually spread beyond their own people. Other nations, too, would come to share in this understanding, benefiting from the teachings preserved and carried forward by the Israelites. In this way, their role was seen as both particular and universal, rooted in their own history, yet destined to influence all humanity. The land of Canaan was regarded as central to this mission. It was seen as especially suited to the development and preservation of this way of life, a place where their laws, customs, and beliefs could be established and maintained across generations. Because of this, even while living in foreign lands such as Egypt, the Israelites felt a deep and constant longing for Canaan. This longing was not only for a place, but for the fulfillment of a promise that had shaped their identity. Their forefathers had assured them that their time away from the land would not be permanent. Though they might live for generations among other peoples, a time would come when they would return. This expectation became a central part of their hope, tied closely to their sense of purpose and destiny. They believed that their return and possession of the land depended on their faithfulness, on their continued worship of the God of their ancestors, and on their commitment to justice and righteousness. The exact details of how this worship should be carried out, or how justice should be practiced in every situation, were not fully defined. Instead, the lives of the patriarchs themselves served as examples. Their actions, as remembered and retold, provided guidance. Through these stories, the people learned what it meant to follow the path laid before them, a path shaped by memory, promise, and the enduring connection between a people and their land. Abraham stands at the beginning of this story as a figure remembered not for power, but for character. Among many ancient peoples, the earliest ancestors were honored as beings of extraordinary strength, sometimes even raised to the level of divine or semi-divine figures. But the descendants of Abraham did not remember him in this way. They did not speak of him as a conqueror, nor as a ruler of vast lands, nor as a being possessing supernatural powers. Instead, they preserved his memory as that of a man who chose restraint over ambition and faith over pride. He was known as Abraham the Hebrew, a name that connects him to a people whose identity was still forming. He had been born in a region called Aram, a land situated beyond the great river Euphrates, one of the major rivers of Western Asia. His parents followed forms of worship that involved many gods, as was common in that time. Yet, according to the traditions passed down through generations, Abraham turned away from these practices. He responded to what he believed was the call of a higher and singular God, separating himself from the beliefs and customs of those around him. In moments of conflict, when disputes arose over land or rights, Abraham did not insist on victory. He chose peace, even if it meant surrendering what might have been his. This willingness to yield for the sake of harmony became one of the defining features of his legacy. His conduct showed a deliberate refusal to allow conflict to shape his life. His generosity was equally remembered. He was described as a man who would go out of his way to welcome strangers, inviting travelers into his home and providing for them. This practice of hospitality was not casual, but central to how he lived. It reflected a broader principle that care for others, even those unknown, was a duty. One of the most striking elements of his story concerns the cities of Sodom and the surrounding region. These cities were believed to have fallen into severe wrongdoing, marked by cruelty and injustice. When the idea of divine punishment arose, Abraham did not respond with approval. Instead, he spoke in defense of the people, asking that the cities be spared if even a small number of righteous individuals could be found within them. This act of intercession revealed a man who valued mercy alongside justice. These memories of Abraham's peace-seeking nature, his generosity, his willingness to submit to a higher will were carefully preserved by his descendants. They believed that such qualities were not only admirable but were in harmony with the will of the God they worshiped. In their understanding, it was because of these virtues that Abraham received protection, and that this protection extended to his family. This belief did not end with Abraham. It continued through his son and his grandson, who were seen as following his example. The idea grew stronger that those who lived with righteousness, justice, and faith would be protected by God. This conviction became deeply rooted in the identity of his descendants. It is within this tradition that the story of Jacob emerges. Jacob, who would later receive the name Israel, a name that would come to represent an entire people, lived a life marked by hardship. His experiences were not easy, and his years were described as both short and filled with labor. Yet, in the memory of his descendants, his life also stood as proof of divine protection. Despite his struggles, he was believed to have been delivered from his difficulties by the God of his fathers. The name Israel, given to Jacob, carried great significance. It became not only his personal identity but the collective name of his descendants, known as the children or sons of Israel. Through them, the traditions of Abraham and Jacob were preserved, forming a foundation of belief and conduct that shaped their understanding of law, morality, and identity. These traditions were not written at first, but passed down within families. They were told and retold, becoming part of a shared memory that guided behavior and reinforced values. They worked alongside the laws that the people followed, helping to explain and give meaning to them. The emergence of Israel as a distinct people did not follow the pattern seen in many other nations. There was no single moment of foundation, no immediate rise under a powerful ruler. Instead, their beginnings were gradual and shaped by unusual circumstances. This development took place in a region known as Goshen, a territory located in the northeastern part of Egypt, close to the land of Palestine. Egypt itself was already an ancient and highly developed civilization. By the time the Israelites settled in Goshen, Egyptian society had existed for many centuries, building cities, establishing systems of government, and constructing monumental structures. In Goshen, the Israelites did not immediately form a unified nation. They existed as 12 separate tribes, each tracing its origin to one of the sons of Jacob. These tribes were connected by shared ancestry and tradition, but they remained loosely organized. Their way of life was simple, centered largely on shepherding and the care of livestock. Leadership within these tribes was not concentrated in a single ruler. Instead, authority rested with elders, known as Zechariah. These were the older and more experienced members of the community who were consulted when important decisions needed to be made. Their role was not that of absolute rulers, but of guides and advisors. There was no central authority binding all the tribes together, and they did not serve under the kings of Egypt, who were known as pharaohs. This absence of the single ruler meant that each tribe maintained a degree of independence. Their structure resembled a loose federation, where decisions were made within each group, allowing them to avoid becoming subjects or servants under a larger power. Although they lived within the borders of Egypt, the Israelites remained distinct from the Egyptian population. The Egyptians generally viewed shepherds with dislike, possibly due to memories of a past period when foreign shepherd rulers, known as the Hyksos, had dominated parts of Egypt. This historical experience may have shaped their attitude, creating a barrier between the two groups. Despite the separation, contact between the Israelites and Egyptians did occur. Some Israelite families moved away from shepherding and began working in agriculture or crafts. This brought them into closer interaction with Egyptian towns and communities. Among the tribes, the group known as Ephraim appears to have had especially close contact with the local population. These interactions had an influence. The Israelites were exposed to a society that had already reached a high level of development. Egypt had a long history, extending back over 1,000 years. Its rulers, the pharaohs, had established large and organized cities. They had constructed massive buildings, including temples dedicated to their gods, pyramids that served as royal tombs, and mausoleums designed to preserve the memory of their rulers. In the ancient land of ancient Egypt, along the fertile banks of the Nile River, a powerful and disciplined priesthood stood at the center of knowledge, skill, and authority. These priests were not merely religious figures, they were the keepers of learning, the masters of practical sciences, and the architects of the kingdom's greatness. Over generations, they refined arts that matched the needs of their land. They developed architecture on a grand scale, raising vast temples and structures that required careful planning and precise measurement. This led them to cultivate the science of geometry, the study of shapes and space, which was essential for building and for managing the land shaped each year by the flooding of the Nile River. They also advanced the art of controlling water through hydraulic constructions, guiding the river's overflow so that it nourished the soil instead of destroying it. In the realm of the human body, they practiced medicine with notable skill. They studied illness and attempted remedies, but their most mysterious practice was embalming. This was the careful preservation of the bodies of the dead, carried out with a belief that the remains must endure forever. Through this process, the departed were prepared for what was believed to be an existence beyond death, their bodies protected from decay through complex and guarded techniques. At the same time, Egyptian craftsmen, working under royal demand, achieved remarkable precision in shaping gold, silver, and precious stones. These objects were not merely decorative, they satisfied the desires of kings, who ruled with immense wealth and authority. Sculpture also flourished, and artists learned to use pigments to bring color and meaning to their creations, whether on walls, statues, or sacred objects. The priests extended their studies into time itself. They observed the cycles of nature and developed systems of chronology, which is the recording and ordering of events in time. Their attention turned upward to the sky, to astronomy, the study of celestial bodies. The regular overflow of the Nile River encouraged this observation, as its cycles seemed connected to patterns in the heavens. Among their greatest achievements was the invention and refinement of writing. At first, they carved records into stone and engraved them on metal, preserving the names and deeds of their rulers. Later, they turned to a more flexible material, the papyrus plant, which grew along the Nile. From its fibers, they created a surface for writing. Their earliest markings were simple and rough figures, but over time these evolved into carefully designed symbols, forming a complex system of communication that could record laws, beliefs, and history. During this period, the people known as the Israelites lived within Egypt. From their contact with Egyptian society, they gained some awareness of these arts and disciplines. Among them, the tribe of Levites stood apart. This group, lacking land and not bound to the daily labor of tending herds or fields, found the opportunity to learn from the Egyptian priests. They adopted the skill of writing and, through their knowledge, came to be regarded by the other Israelite tribes as a priestly class. Even while still in Egypt, they held a distinct and elevated position because of this learning. The time spent in Egypt brought clear benefits to the Israelites. It lifted some of them from a simple and undeveloped way of life into a more advanced level of culture and understanding. Yet this gain came with a hidden cost. The same environment that offered knowledge also exposed them to beliefs and practices that carried deep consequences. For in Egypt, religion had taken a form that stood apart in its complexity and its influence. The Egyptians had moved far beyond the earliest stage of worship, often called fetish worship, in which objects are believed to hold spiritual power. Instead, they had built a vast system of polytheism, meaning the worship of many gods. These gods were not limited to a single region or tradition. The beliefs of different districts were combined and interwoven, forming a unified but elaborate religious structure. Both gods and goddesses were honored, each associated with particular powers and roles. What made this system striking was the nature of the gods themselves. Rather than elevating divine beings above humanity, the Egyptians often represented them in forms that blended human and animal features, or even reduced them entirely to animal shapes. These forms were then worshipped as sacred and powerful. The chief god, Ammon, often called Ammon, was depicted with the horns of a ram. The goddess Pakhet, sometimes known as Pet or Pat, was shown with the head of a cat. Hathor, associated with desire and indulgence, wore the head of a cow. Osiris, widely worshipped across the land, was represented in a form that many would find unsettling, while Isis, honored everywhere, was also frequently depicted with the features of a cow. Animals themselves were treated as sacred. In the Nile region, where animals were not abundant, their preservation became important, and this importance turned into reverence. Certain animals were elevated to divine status. The black bull known as Apis was worshipped in the city of Memphis. The white bull called Nevis was honored in Heliopolis. Goats, dogs, and especially cats received similar devotion. Birds, snakes, and even small creatures like mice were included in the system of worship. The value placed on these animals was so extreme that harming one of them, particularly a sacred bull or cat, was punished more severely than taking a human life. The Israelites, living among this culture, witnessed these practices daily. The effects were profound. A society that attributed divine power to animals began to reflect those beliefs in its structure and behavior. The dignity of human life diminished, and the treatment of people followed this decline. At the top stood the rulers of Egypt, the pharaohs. They claimed descent from the gods themselves and were worshipped as divine beings even while alive. Their authority was absolute. The land and everything within it, including the people, were considered their possession. When land was granted to farmers, it was not a right but an act of royal favor. The result was a society not of free citizens, but of subjects bound to service. Vast numbers of people were compelled into labor, forced to build enormous temples and towering pyramids that symbolized the power of the state and its rulers. These projects demanded relentless effort from countless workers. Supporting the system were the priests, who reinforced the authority of the pharaohs. No matter how heavy the burden placed upon the people, the priests declared the kings to be divine or semi-divine beings, deserving of obedience and reverence. Under such pressure, the population changed. Over time, many lost their sense of independence and personal worth. The weight of constant labor and strict control shaped a society that accepted its condition. The people endured their situation without resistance, submitting to a system that denied them freedom and reduced them to a state of complete dependence. The form of worship that had taken root in the land of Egypt at that time carried with it consequences that deeply affected the moral life of its people. The system of idolatry, in which animals and natural forms were elevated to the level of divine beings, gradually altered the standards by which conduct was judged. When creatures of the animal world were placed alongside the gods, distinctions that had once guided behavior began to fade. Practices involving animals, regarded as improper in other traditions, became frequent and passed without punishment or public shame. In the representations of these deities, figures were often portrayed in ways that removed the expectation of restraint or discipline. When the gods themselves were depicted without moral limitation, there remained little incentive for human beings to hold themselves to a higher standard. The influence of such examples spread easily, for actions rooted in error and excess tend to be readily imitated. Among the Israelites, particularly those living in close proximity to Egyptian society, these influences gradually took hold. They began to adopt distorted forms of worship and gave themselves over to unchecked behavior. This decline unfolded alongside a growing change in their political condition. For a long period, the Israelites had lived in the region known as Land of Goshen without disturbance. They had originally been regarded as wandering shepherds, people unlikely to establish a lasting presence. Yet as decades passed, and even a full century elapsed, they remained and increased in number. Their continued growth drew the attention and concern of the ruling authority. Within the royal council of the Egyptian king, a new attitude emerged. The freedom enjoyed by the Israelites began to be viewed with suspicion, especially since such freedom was not granted to many native Egyptians themselves. The court feared that this large and distinct population, settled within Goshen, might one day rise in opposition or join external enemies in conflict. To prevent such a possibility, a decisive policy was enacted. The Israelites were declared to be bondmen, stripped of their former liberty and compelled to perform forced labor. Their lives, once marked by relative independence, were now confined within conditions described as a house of bondage and an iron furnace, expressions used to convey the severity of their oppression. In addition to labor, measures were taken to reduce their numbers. The king issued a command that male infants born among the Israelites were to be put to death by drowning in the waters of the Nile River or in its canals, while female children were allowed to live. Under such conditions, the question arose whether the Israelites would remain faithful to the traditions passed down from their ancestors, or whether they would abandon them and follow the gods of the surrounding culture. For many, the strain proved too great. Though they retained a faint awareness that the God of their forefathers differed from the visible idols of Egypt, even this understanding began to weaken. The pressures of suffering, the desire to imitate those around them, and the daily weight of hardship dulled their perception and obscured the memory of their inherited law. In their uncertainty, many turned toward the visible objects of worship that seemed to favor their oppressors. They directed their prayers to deities recognized in Egyptian religion, including the sacred bull known as Apis, and they also offered devotion to other animal forms. The unseen God of their ancestors, remembered only through tradition, seemed distant and uncertain in comparison. As this transformation spread, even the social fabric of the Israelite community began to weaken. The distinctions that had once guided conduct were eroded, and many adopted the practices of the surrounding society. It was even believed by some that reverence shown to animal forms might in some way honor the god of their ancestors, revealing how far understanding had shifted when guided by confusion rather than clarity. Once the mind moves along an uncertain path, its conclusions can extend without clear limit. In these circumstances, the Israelites might have entirely lost their distinct identity, as had happened to many other groups who had come under the influence of the people of Han, a term used to describe the Egyptian nation in ancient tradition. Yet this outcome was prevented by the emergence of three individuals, two brothers and their sister, who became instruments of a higher purpose and awakened their people from the state of decline. These figures were Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Their role was not merely to lead but to restore, to guide their people toward liberation and renewal. Their work would have consequences extending far beyond their own generation. The details of their early lives and development are only sparsely preserved. Few characteristics remain that allow a full understanding of how their insight grew, step by step, from the earliest beginnings of inherited belief to a clear vision of purpose. The process by which they became capable of fulfilling such a mission is not fully recorded, leaving much of their transformation beyond direct explanation. What is known is that they belonged to a particular group within the Israelite people, the tribe of Levi. This tribe was regarded as possessing a higher level of knowledge and was associated with sacred duties. Within this tribe, it is believed that the memory of the patriarchs, the founding ancestors of the Israelites, had been carefully preserved. Along with this memory, they maintained belief in the God of their forefathers. Because of this continuity, they remain separate from the surrounding influences of Egyptian idolatry and its practices, holding themselves apart from the customs that had drawn many others away from their original tradition. Thus it came to pass that Aaron, who was the elder brother, together with Moses and their sister Miriam, were raised in surroundings that preserved a higher sense of moral conduct and religious belief than that which prevailed widely around them. Their upbringing was shaped by the traditions handed down from their ancestors, traditions that spoke of one supreme God and of a life guided by justice and righteousness. Of Moses, the historical accounts tell a story marked from the beginning by danger and secrecy. At the time of his birth, a command had been issued by the ruler of Egypt, known as Pharaoh, the title given to the kings of that powerful ancient kingdom. This command required that Hebrew male children be put to death, cast into the waters of the great river Nile, which was the central lifeline of Egypt. In order to protect her child from this decree, the mother of Moses hid him for 3 months, concealing his existence and defying the authority of the king. As he grew, Moses became familiar with the royal environment of Egypt. He is described as having knowledge of the court of Pharaoh, whether in Memphis, one of the principal capitals of ancient Egypt, or in Tanis, also known as Zoan, another important center of royal administration. In these places, he would have encountered the learning and culture of one of the most advanced civilizations of the time. He possessed a sharp and active mind, and through his abilities he gained access to the knowledge that Egypt had to offer. Yet it was not only his intellect that set him apart. He was known for qualities that were quieter but no less significant. He was gentle in character and modest in his conduct. The records do not celebrate him as a warrior or as a conqueror. Instead, they describe him as a man of humility, stating that he was the most meek among men. This emphasis on selflessness and restraint defined his character more strongly than any display of force. Guided by the teachings that had come down from Abraham, which emphasized that the one God valued justice, Moses found himself troubled by what he observed in Egypt. The religious practices of the Egyptians included the worship of animals and physical representations, forms of belief that he regarded as without foundation when compared to the idea of a single, unseen God. Alongside this, he witnessed widespread injustice within society. There existed deep divisions among the people, structured into rigid groups known as castes, where individuals were assigned positions that determined their rights and limitations. Many were subjected to harsh conditions, treated as if they were less than human. A system of slavery was firmly established, in which entire populations, including the Israelites, were forced into labor under the authority of both kings and religious officials. This system created an environment where inequality and oppression were common. Moses saw these conditions clearly and understood their harmful effects. He recognized that such practices did not only harm individuals but also weaken the moral strength of his own people. The Israelites, living under these pressures, were at risk of losing the values that had once guided them. This realization deeply troubled him. He did not remain silent in the face of injustice. His nature compelled him to act. One day, he witnessed an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, an act of cruelty directed at one of his own people. Overcome with anger at this injustice, Moses intervened and struck down the Egyptian. This act, though driven by a desire to defend the oppressed, placed him in great danger. Knowing that his action could be discovered and punished, he fled from Egypt. His journey took him into the desert, a vast and sparsely inhabited region. There, he came to an oasis, a place where water allowed life to exist amid the surrounding dryness. This oasis lay near Mount Sinai, a mountain that would later become of great importance in his story. In this region lived a group known as the Kenites, who were connected to a larger people called the Midianites, a nomadic tribe that moved through the lands east and south of Canaan. Even in this new environment, Moses encountered situations of injustice. He saw shepherdesses, women responsible for tending flocks, being mistreated and driven away by others. Once again, he chose to intervene, offering his help and protection. Through this act, he came into contact with their father, a leader among the Midianites, described as a priest or elder, meaning both a spiritual guide and a figure of authority within the tribe. This man, known as Reuel, welcomed Moses, and in time Moses married his daughter, Zipporah. Moses settled into a new life among the Midianites. His role was that of a shepherd, tending the flocks of his father-in-law. He guided the animals across grazing lands that lay between the Red Sea, a large body of water to the west, and the mountainous regions nearby. In this quiet and isolated setting, removed from the structures and conflicts of Egypt, his inner life began to deepen. It was during this period of solitude that what is described as the prophetic spirit came upon him. This term refers to a profound and mysterious capacity of the human mind and soul. It is not easily explained, even by those who have studied human thought and the nature of existence. There are depths within the human being that remain beyond clear understanding, even to careful observers. Yet it is evident that the human mind possesses the ability to perceive truths that are not directly revealed through the senses. Without relying on sight, hearing, or touch, the mind can grasp patterns, connections, and meanings within the unfolding of events. Through this inner capacity, people have discovered principles about the world and about human life that cannot be reached by physical observation alone. The senses can confirm or correct these insights, but they do not create them. Instead, there exists within the soul a faculty that allows it to reach beyond immediate experience, uncovering deeper truths. Through this power, human beings have come to understand the workings of nature and have learned to use its forces for their purposes. This same inner faculty can also turn toward questions of moral conduct and the nature of existence itself. It can offer glimpses into what lies beyond the present, suggesting possibilities for the future and guiding decisions about right and wrong. It may even approach an understanding, however limited, of the being believed to have created and sustained the universe. Such insight, however, is not accessible to everyone in equal measure. A person whose life is dominated by selfish desires, by constant attachment to ordinary concerns, cannot easily reach this level of awareness. But a person who is free from selfishness, who is not controlled by lower impulses, and who strives toward a higher standard of moral life, may become capable of receiving such understanding. A soul that is devoted to seeking what is right, that is focused on a higher purpose, and that is deeply connected to the idea of the divine, may be able to perceive truths that guide not only personal conduct but the direction of an entire people. As the centuries passed in the history of the people known as Israel, there arose, again and again, individuals of remarkable clarity of mind and purpose. These were men who were regarded as pure in thought and intention, and who were believed to possess an unusual ability to perceive what lay ahead in time. They were called prophets, meaning those who receive and communicate messages believed to come from God. These prophets did not speak only of present conditions, but of future events, both for the Israelites and for other nations. Their words were remembered because later generations believed that many of these predictions had come to pass. Among all these prophetic figures, one name stood above the rest. This was Moses, identified as the son of Amram, with Amram being his father. The prophets who came after him placed him at the very beginning of their line, and far above themselves in importance. They did not see themselves as equals to him, but as reflections of his example. In their view, Moses was not only the first of the great prophets, but the greatest. His understanding was considered clearer, his message more direct, and his insight more certain than that of any who followed. The traditions describe Moses as a man whose inner life was marked by clarity, humility, and a complete absence of selfish ambition. It is said that if any human being had ever been given a clear vision of divine purpose, it was Moses. His transformation began in a remote and difficult landscape in the desert region of Sinai. This area lies between Egypt and the land of Canaan and is known for its harsh conditions. Within this desert stood a mountain called Horeb. At the foot of this mountain, Moses was engaged in a simple task. He was tending the flock of his father-in-law, caring for animals as part of his daily responsibility. It was there, according to the ancient record, that he experienced what was described as his first direct revelation from God. This moment was not presented as calm or ordinary. It affected him deeply, stirring his entire being and changing the course of his life. After this encounter, Moses returned to his responsibilities, but he was no longer the same person. He carried within him a new sense of direction and purpose. He believed that he had been chosen to act, to take responsibility for the condition of his people. The people he referred to were his own tribal relatives, the Israelites, who were living under conditions of forced labor in Egypt. He felt compelled to lead them out of the state and to guide them toward a higher form of life, one based on moral discipline and obedience to a single God. At the same time, another figure was drawn into this unfolding mission. This was Aaron, the brother of Moses, who had remained in Egypt while Moses had been living in the desert. According to the tradition, Aaron also received a form of revelation, instructing him to go and meet his brother at Mount Horeb. There, the two were united in purpose, preparing together for the task that lay ahead. They understood clearly that their mission would not be easy. In their judgment, the greater difficulty did not lie in persuading the ruler of Egypt to release the Israelites. Instead, the greater challenge was to change the mindset of the people themselves. Generations of forced labor had shaped their thinking. Many had become accustomed to their condition, losing the desire for freedom. The idea of liberty, with all its uncertainties, seemed less appealing than the harsh stability of servitude. Moses and Aaron, despite their advanced age, did not withdraw from this responsibility. They prepared themselves with determination, relying on what they believed to be the support of the God of their ancestors. Their first step was to approach the elders of the Israelites. These elders were the heads of families and tribes, respected figures who represented the people in matters of importance. To these elders, Moses and Aaron delivered their message. They declared that God had seen the suffering of the Israelites, that he intended to bring them out of their oppression, and that he would lead them back to the land associated with their ancestors. The elders listened and responded positively to this message, recognizing its significance. However, the wider population did not respond in the same way. The majority of the people, worn down by labor and hardship, reacted with indifference. Their long experience of subjugation had made them cautious and doubtful. They found it difficult to believe in the possibility of change. Some were not even willing to abandon the religious practices they had adopted in Egypt, including the worship of Egyptian gods. Arguments and assurances failed to persuade them. Their response reflected fear rather than hope. They expressed the belief that it was safer to remain in bondage than to face the unknown dangers of the desert. Despite this resistance, Moses and Aaron proceeded with their mission. They went before the ruler of Egypt, known as Pharaoh, a title used for the kings of ancient Egypt. Standing before him, they presented their demand. They spoke in the name of the God they served, asking that the Israelites be released from forced labor. They argued that the Israelites had originally come into Egypt by their own choice and therefore retained their natural right to freedom. Pharaoh did not accept this demand. From his perspective, the request was unreasonable. The Israelites formed a large labor force, working in agriculture and construction, contributing to the wealth and stability of his kingdom. To release them, especially on the authority of a God he did not acknowledge, seemed unacceptable. Instead of granting freedom, Pharaoh responded by increasing the burden placed upon the Israelites. He ordered that their work be made more difficult, intending to leave them with no time or energy to think about rebellion or escape. This decision had immediate consequences. The conditions of the people worsened, and they turned against Moses and Aaron, blaming them for the increased hardship. The situation continued to escalate. According to the tradition, a series of extraordinary events followed, described as plagues. These were seen as acts of divine intervention, intended to compel Pharaoh to change his decision. Each event added pressure, affecting both the ruler and the country as a whole. Over time, these repeated calamities created a growing sense of fear and urgency. Eventually, Pharaoh reached a point where he could no longer ignore the situation. The accumulation of disasters led him to reconsider his position. He became convinced that resistance might lead to greater destruction. In response, he urged the Israelites to leave Egypt without delay, fearing that any further hesitation could bring ruin upon his land. The departure of the Israelites happened quickly. They had little time to prepare, gathering only what was necessary for the journey ahead. The moment of their departure was fixed in memory. It took place at daybreak on the 15th day of the month called Nisan, which corresponds roughly to the month of March. On that morning, the people who had lived in servitude for generations left Egypt as free individuals, without engaging in battle or shedding blood. This event held deep significance. It marked the first time that this people experienced freedom as a collective reality. The idea of liberty, of being free from forced labor and external control, became central to their identity. It was regarded as a value of the highest importance, something to be protected and remembered. Large numbers of people took part in this movement. Families gathered their belongings, prepared themselves for travel, and moved together. They assembled near a place called Ramesses, a city associated with Egyptian administration and labor. Alongside them were other groups, described as related tribes, who shared similarities in language and way of life. These groups joined the migration, increasing its scale and complexity. At the center of this movement stood Moses. He was not a king in the traditional sense, and he did not seek power. Yet, in practice, he became the leader of the people. His authority came from his role as a guide and teacher. He was seen as someone who sought to establish fairness among individuals, promoting the idea that all people held value. The responsibility placed upon him during this journey was immense. Leading the people out of Egypt was only the beginning. He faced the challenge of transforming a large group of individuals, many of whom had known only servitude, into a unified people with shared purpose and discipline. He needed to guide them, to secure a place where they could live, and to provide them with a system of laws that would govern their conduct. Among the 12 tribes, one group stood out in its support of Moses. This was the tribe of Levi. The Levites, as members of this tribe were called, shared his commitment and assisted him in his work. They played a key role in helping him instruct and organize the people. As the Israelites departed, the Egyptians were occupied with dealing with the effects of the recent calamities, including the burial of those who had died. The Israelites, now several generations removed from their original ancestors who had first entered Egypt, left after having lived there for many centuries. They began their journey toward the region that separates Egypt from Canaan, the land associated with their earlier history. This route followed the general direction by which their ancestors had once entered Egypt. However, Moses made a deliberate decision regarding their path. He chose not to lead them along the shortest route, which would have taken them along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. His reasoning was based on caution. The coastal regions were inhabited by established populations who might resist the entry of a large migrating group. There was also concern about the readiness of the Israelites themselves. After generations of hardship, they were not prepared for immediate conflict. Moses feared that if they encountered opposition too soon, they might lose courage and retreat. After leaving the land of ancient Egypt, the people known as the Israelites set their course toward Mount Sinai. This mountain, located in a rugged peninsula between Africa and Asia, was to become the place where they would receive laws and commands that would guide their lives as a free people. Their liberation from bondage had not been an end in itself, but a beginning, leading them toward a new order of life based on instruction and discipline. Yet even as they moved forward, danger followed behind them. The ruler of Egypt, the Pharaoh, had begun to regret his decision. In a moment of weakness, he had allowed the Israelites to depart, releasing a vast labor force that had long served his kingdom. Soon, his resolve hardened. He determined to pursue them, to bring them back, and to restore them to the condition of slavery from which they had escaped. As the Israelites journeyed, they suddenly saw the Egyptian forces advancing in the distance. The sight filled them with fear. Their situation appeared hopeless. Before them stretched the waters of the Red Sea, blocking their path. Behind them came the army of Egypt, with chariots, horses, and soldiers moving swiftly to overtake them. There seemed to be no path of escape. Panic spread among the people. Their voices rose in distress and accusation. Some turned against their leader, Moses, the man who had guided them out of Egypt. In their despair, they cried out, questioning whether it would not have been better to remain in Egypt, even in bondage, than to face death in the wilderness. They spoke with bitterness, asking whether there had been no graves in Egypt, that they had been brought out into the desert to perish. At that moment, when fear and confusion threatened to overcome them, an unexpected means of escape appeared. During the night, a powerful wind, described as coming from the northeast, drove the waters of the sea away from the shore. The force of this wind pushed the water southward, exposing the bed of the sea. For a time, much of it became dry ground. Recognizing the sudden change, Moses acted without hesitation. He urged the people forward, directing them toward the path that had opened before them. He spoke with certainty, convinced that the Egyptians would not prevail against them again. Under his guidance, the Israelites began to cross the exposed seabed. They moved quickly across the short distance, passing between waters that rose on either side. The deeper parts of the sea, stirred by the storm, stood like walls to the right and to the left, while the ground beneath their feet remained firm enough to bear their passage. It was a moment filled with urgency, as the entire multitude pressed forward toward the opposite shore. Behind them, the Egyptian forces continued their pursuit. Confident in their strength, they entered the same pathway, determined to capture those who had fled. Their chariots rolled forward, their horses driven onward, as they followed the Israelites across the sea. At the break of day, the Egyptians reached the western side and saw the Israelites already nearing safety on the opposite shore. Without delay, they advanced along the same route. But at that critical moment, the wind ceased. The force that had held back the waters came to an end. The waters, which had been held apart, surged back into their natural place. The great masses of water, which had risen like walls, collapsed inward. They rushed over the pathway, covering the ground where the Egyptian army had advanced. Men, horses, and chariots were overwhelmed and drawn beneath the sea. The destruction was complete. The pursuing force, which had seemed so powerful, was lost in the depths. Later, the waters carried some of the bodies to the shore where the Israelites had gathered, safe from danger. There, they saw with their own eyes the outcome of what had taken place. This event left a deep impression upon them. Even those who had doubted were struck by what they had witnessed. Fear gave way to confidence. On that day, they placed their trust in their God and in Moses, who had led them through the crisis. Their response was not silent. Together, they raised their voices in a united expression of praise, acknowledging their deliverance. They sang words that declared their belief in the power that had saved them, words that spoke of triumph over the enemy and of the downfall of the forces that had pursued them. The memory of these events remained fixed in their minds. 3 moments stood together: their release from Egypt, their passage through the sea, and the sudden destruction of the enemy that had sought to reclaim them. These were not passing incidents, but defining experiences that shaped their understanding of themselves and their future. In later times of danger and hardship, they would look back to this moment. The recollection of what had occurred strengthened their courage and renewed their belief that the same power which had brought them out of Egypt and had opened a path through the sea would continue to guide and protect them. Yet this confidence did not remain constant among all. Many among the people soon fell again into doubt and fear whenever new difficulties arose. Their trust wavered with each challenge, but there was also a portion among them, those who reflected more deeply, who held firmly to the lessons of that experience. These individuals drew strength from what they had seen and carried that strength into future trials. Now free from immediate danger, the tribes continued their journey. They moved forward without the threat of pursuit, no longer bound by the oppression that had defined their lives in Egypt. Their destination, Mount Sinai, still lay many days ahead. It was the temporary goal of their wandering, the place where their new identity would take clear form. The land through which they traveled was a desert, marked by stretches of sand and barren ground. Yet it was not entirely without resources. There were places where water could be found, and areas where pasture allowed their flocks to survive. This region was not unfamiliar to Moses. Before his role as leader, he had lived in this area while tending the flocks of his father-in-law, gaining knowledge of its paths and conditions. In the mountainous regions around Mount Sinai, especially during the spring season, water flowed from the rocks. It emerged in streams, forming small channels that ran down toward the Red Sea. These natural sources provided relief in an otherwise harsh environment. Food, however, presented a different challenge. The Israelites did not have the supplies they had known in Egypt. In place of bread, They found a substance that appeared regularly and in large quantities. They gathered it and lived on it for an extended period. Over time, they came to regard this provision as something extraordinary. This substance, known as manna, was associated with the natural features of the region. In that peninsula, certain trees called tamarisk trees produced drops of a sweet substance. These trees were common in that area. In the early morning, small drops would appear, round in shape, resembling seeds such as coriander. They were described as sweet, similar to honey. However, as the day grew warmer, these drops would melt away under the heat of the sun. Sustained by this provision and guided by their leader, the Israelites continued their journey through the desert, moving steadily toward the mountain that awaited them. Filled with a sense of elevation after the extraordinary events they had already experienced, the tribes appeared at last prepared to receive what was regarded as their most sacred possession. The very purpose for which they had endured a long and winding journey through the desert known as Sinai Peninsula. From the place called Rephidim, situated at a considerable height, they were led still further upward toward the highest range of the mountain known as Mount Sinai, whose summit seemed to rise into the clouds themselves. To this elevated region, Moses brought the Israelites in the third month following their departure from the land of Egypt. There he determined the place where they would encamp. Before anything further could occur, he prepared the people for an event of overwhelming significance, one that would affect both sight and hearing, and leave a lasting impression upon their understanding. They were instructed to purify themselves through prayer and abstinence, so that they might become capable of receiving what was to be revealed, and worthy of the role they were to assume. With anticipation mixed with anxiety, they awaited the appointed third day. A boundary was established around the nearer summit of the mountain, preventing the people from approaching too closely. On the morning of that day, a dense cloud settled upon the mountain peak. Lightning appeared, and the mountain seemed surrounded by fire. Thunder followed, echoing across the surrounding heights. The entire scene created the impression of a world shaken to its limits. Young and old alike stood in fear before what unfolded, witnessing a display that seemed beyond ordinary experience. Yet the greatest weight did not lie in what was seen, but in what was heard. The cloud, the fire, and the thunder served only as a preparation for the words that followed. From the summit of the mountain came a series of declarations, 10 in number, clear in meaning and direct in their message. These were the commandments, principles simple enough to be understood by all, yet profound enough to shape the foundation of human conduct. Text the 10 Commandments. The people became convinced that these words were revealed by a divine source. Actions such as theft and false testimony were clearly condemned as wrong. Beyond outward acts, even inward intentions were addressed, as the prohibition extended to desire itself, forbidding coveting what belonged to another. In this way, both conduct and thought were brought under a single moral order. Other civilizations, including those of India and Egypt, had over more than 2,000 years produced great monuments and passed through many historical changes. Yet all such developments appeared small when compared to the single moment in which a complete moral framework was presented at once. What occurred at Sinai was not limited to that time alone. It established enduring principles, affirming the importance of ethical conduct and the inherent dignity of human life. With the proclamation of this law, a new identity was formed, marking the emergence of a distinct people. The laws, understood as originating from a divine source beyond human perception, addressed essential aspects of life: respect for parents, purity in personal conduct, protection of life and property, honesty in relationships, and integrity in thought. The Israelites, who had approached the mountain as a people under oppression, returned to their dwellings with a new sense of purpose. They were now regarded as a community set apart, described as a nation of righteousness. By applying these commandments in daily life, they were to serve as an example to others, carrying a responsibility that extended beyond their own existence. These teachings were preserved in a durable form. They were inscribed upon stone tablets, ensuring that they could be remembered and transmitted across generations. These tablets came to be known as the tables of the testimony, or the tables of the law. They were placed within a sacred chest, which became a central point of gathering where Moses would assemble the leaders of the people. This chest, containing the tablets, symbolized the covenant between the people and their God, and was therefore called the Ark of the Covenant. From this foundation, a broader system of laws developed, applying these principles to both public and private life. The structure of society was reshaped. Permanent enslavement among the Israelites was no longer permitted. A person who lost his freedom could serve only for a limited period of 6 years, regaining liberty in the seventh. Serious crimes such as deliberate murder and acts of extreme disrespect toward parents were punishable by death, and no sanctuary could protect those guilty of such offenses. The laws extended even to those outside the Israelite community. The killing of a non Israelite servant required punishment, and a servant who suffered mistreatment could claim freedom. If a man wronged a young woman, he was required to marry her and provide compensation to her family. Care for widows, orphans, and foreigners was strictly commanded, reflecting the memory of the Israelites' own past as strangers in a foreign land. They were instructed not to repeat the injustices they had once endured. Despite the clarity and elevation of these laws, they did not immediately transform the habits of the people. The expectations they set were demanding and required a level of discipline not easily attained. During a period when Moses withdrew to prepare further for the reception of the law, a portion of the people grew uncertain. Believing themselves abandoned in the desert, they demanded a visible representation of divinity. In the absence of Moses, Aaron assumed leadership. Under pressure from the people, he consented to their demand and permitted the creation of the golden image, modeled after the sacred bull worshipped in Egypt, associated with figures such as a peace. The people gathered around this image, offering it honor and devotion. When Moses descended from Mount Sinai and witnessed this act, he responded with decisive severity. He commanded the tribe of Levi to act against those involved, and a large number of people were put to death. Only through such strict action, it was believed, could the spread of idolatry be halted and the newly established order preserved. In order to prevent the people from falling back into the practices of idolatry, meaning the worship of physical images or objects as gods, and to support them during their gradual transition from a less developed state of belief to a more refined understanding, certain allowances were made. The people were not yet capable of grasping a purely spiritual idea of the deity, meaning the one supreme God, without any form of visible aid. Therefore, they were permitted to associate their understanding of the divine with something material, not as an image of God Himself, but as a reminder that could be perceived by their senses. At the mountain called Sinai, a place of great significance in their history, they had witnessed powerful natural phenomena. There had been flashes of lightning, accompanied by fire, and from within a cloud that appeared to burn, they had heard the proclamation of the Ten Commandments. These commandments were a set of fundamental laws, intended to guide moral and religious life. To preserve the memory of this moment, an emblem was introduced. This emblem did not represent God directly, but symbolized the manner in which the divine presence had been revealed at Sinai. It was therefore commanded that a fire should be kept burning continuously upon an altar, an elevated structure used for religious purposes. This altar was not fixed in one place but made to be carried along as the tribes moved from one location to another. The fire upon it served as a visible sign, reminding the people of the revelation they had experienced. It was not the deity itself that was represented, but the event of revelation, the moment when divine law had been made known to them. Another concession to the limited understanding of the people was the continuation of sacrificial rites. These were practices in which offerings, often of animals or produce, were presented as acts of devotion. The spiritual teaching that had been given at Sinai did not intend these sacrifices to be the true expression of worship. Instead, it aimed to guide the people toward a life defined by moral conduct and holiness. However, the people had not yet reached a level where they could fully embrace this idea. Therefore, sacrifices were permitted as a transitional practice, a step in their gradual development. Among many ancient nations, sacrifices were believed to appease or win favor from their gods. The Israelites were allowed to continue similar practices, but with important changes. The form of worship was simplified, and strict limits were placed upon it. The altar became part of a central place of worship known as the sanctuary, a sacred space set apart for religious observance. Within this sanctuary, no image or statue was allowed, distinguishing it from the temples of other peoples. Instead, the sanctuary contained specific symbolic objects. There was a candelabrum, a structure designed to hold lights, representing illumination and presence. There was also a table upon which were placed 12 loaves of bread, each loaf symbolizing one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the divisions of the people descended from the 12 sons of Jacob. In addition, there was a special enclosed space that housed the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest that represented the agreement between the people and their God. The presence of the altar, the sanctuary, and the sacrificial practices required the existence of the group set apart for religious duties. This group formed the priesthood, an ancient institution that had existed even before this time. Among the Israelites, the tribe of Levi was chosen for this role. The Levites were considered the most devoted to religious service and the most knowledgeable in matters of law and tradition. They were assigned the responsibility of carrying out the sacred duties, much as they had done during the period when the people lived in Egypt. However, there was a significant difference between the priests of Israel and those of Egypt. In Egypt, priests often possessed land and wealth, which could lead to the misuse of their authority. To prevent such corruption, the Israelite priests were forbidden to own land. This rule ensured that their focus remained on their sacred responsibilities. Instead of land, their support came from the offerings brought by the people, which provided for their needs without granting them independent economic power. Alongside this system, there existed an older custom that could not be immediately removed. This tradition, dating back to the time of the patriarchs, required that the firstborn son in each family take part in performing sacrificial duties. Because this practice was deeply rooted, it continued for a time alongside the established priesthood of the Levites. Both systems, however, stood somewhat apart from the pure teaching given at Sinai, which aimed beyond such rituals toward a higher moral life. The conditions of the age required patience and gradual change. The people needed guidance that combined allowance for their current understanding with steps toward refinement. Only those with deeper spiritual insight could maintain awareness that sacrifices were not the ultimate purpose, but a temporary measure. During the 40 years in which the Israelites moved through the desert, they searched for grazing lands for their flocks within mountainous regions and nearby areas. This long period of wandering was not without purpose. It became a time of instruction and transformation. Moses, as their leader and teacher, used this time to guide the people, teaching them the laws and principles they were to follow. Over these years, the older generation, those who had left Egypt, gradually passed away. In their place arose a new generation, shaped by the teachings they had received. This younger group became disciplined, devoted to their beliefs, and courageous. They gained a clearer understanding of their laws and developed into a community capable of acting together with unity and purpose. To govern this growing community, Moses established a system of leadership. He chose 70 elders, each representing a family group, to serve as his advisors. This council of elders played an important role in decision making and in managing the affairs of the people. Their participation created a model for future systems of governance. Following the advice of his father-in-law, Jethro, who had observed the burden placed upon him, Moses also appointed judges at different levels. Some were responsible for groups of 10 families, others for 100, and others for 1,000. This structure allowed disputes and matters of concern to be handled efficiently. The people themselves selected these judges, showing a form of participation and governance, and then presented their choices to Moses for confirmation. These judges were given clear instructions. They were to act with fairness in all cases, whether the matter involved members of the Israelite tribes or individuals from other groups living among them. They were not to favor the powerful over the weak, nor the wealthy over the poor. They were forbidden to accept bribes, ensuring that their decisions remained just. Their guiding principle was that justice ultimately belonged to God, and that they were to reflect this divine standard in their judgments. The values taught during this period emphasized unity, mutual care, equality before the law, fairness, and compassion. These principles became central to the identity of the people. Later generations would look back on this time as a formative and meaningful period. The prophets, who were teachers and guides in later history, would describe it in symbolic terms, calling it a time of closeness between the people and their God, like a union marked by loyalty and commitment. As the years passed, the period of wandering drew near to its end. The younger generation was now prepared to settle in the land that had long been promised to them. Remaining in the desert for too long would have risked making them accustomed to a life of constant movement, like the nomadic tribes known as the Midianites and the Amalekites, who lived without permanent settlements. There were attempts to move toward their destination. At one point, some groups tried to advance in a northern direction, following established routes used by traders traveling between regions. This effort, however, ended in failure, and some were captured by opposing forces. This defeat did not go unanswered. Members of the tribe of Judah, one of the 12 tribes descended from the sons of Jacob, joined by individuals from the tribe of Simon and assisted by the Kenites, carried out a counterattack. Together, they succeeded in taking several cities. Meanwhile, the rest of the tribes prepared for a different approach. Instead of entering the land directly from the west, they planned to move around and approach from the eastern side. This route, however, was not straightforward. The people known as the Idumeans, also called Edomites, lived in the mountainous region of Seir. They refused to allow the Israelites to pass through their territory. Their refusal was likely driven by fear, as they believed that the approaching tribes might attempt to take their land. Because they were not permitted to engage in conflict with the Idumeans or with related groups such as the Ammonites, the Israelites were forced to take a longer path. They moved around the region, traveling east of the mountains of Seir. This detour led them along the edges of the desert, until they reached inhabited areas near the source of the river Arnon, a river that flows into the body of water known as the Dead Sea. Moses, who had guided the people through hardship and uncertainty, now turned to a moment that required both caution and diplomacy. Before the Israelites could reach the river called the Jordan, which lay between them and the land they sought, they had to pass through territories already occupied by other rulers. One of these rulers was Sihon, a king who governed a region east of the Jordan. Rather than begin with conflict, Moses chose a peaceful approach. He sent messages to Sihon requesting permission for the Israelites to pass through his land. These messages were respectful and conciliatory, meaning they were intended to avoid hostility and to secure agreement without force. The request was simple: safe passage for people moving toward their destination. Sihon refused. Instead of granting passage, he prepared for war. He gathered his army and advanced toward the edge of the desert, intending to block the progress of the Israelites and to confront them directly. At this moment, a new generation of Israelites stood ready. These were not the people who had first left Egypt in fear and uncertainty. These were their descendants, raised in the wilderness, hardened by experience, and filled with the sense of strength. They organized themselves for battle, forming ranks and preparing to meet the approaching forces. The confrontation took place at a location called Jaz. There, the Israelites engaged the army of Sihon. The outcome was decisive. The opposing forces were defeated, and Sihon himself was killed in the battle. This was not a minor encounter, but a turning point. The victory carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. For the Israelites, it brought a new sense of confidence. Until this moment, they had been a people in transition, uncertain of their ability to secure a permanent home. Now, they saw that they could overcome established powers. This realization strengthened their position and changed their outlook. They did not continue their journey immediately. Instead, they took possession of the land they had conquered. This marked a significant shift. For a long time, they had lived as nomads, moving from place to place without permanent settlement. Now, they began to establish themselves in a fixed territory. While the Israelites grew more confident, the surrounding nations reacted differently. The people of Canaan, who inhabited the land toward which the Israelites were moving, became deeply alarmed. The defeat of Sihon, who had been regarded as a strong and capable ruler, spread fear among them. The balance of power had changed, and the presence of the Israelites could no longer be ignored. Freed from the narrow limitations of desert travel and no longer hindered by hostile tribes, the Israelites now moved with greater ease. The dangers that had once surrounded them seemed to have diminished. Yet, this new sense of security brought its own challenges. With the removal of immediate threats, both noble and harmful tendencies began to emerge among the people. Confidence could inspire discipline and unity, but it could also lead to carelessness and moral weakness. Nearby, another nation watched these developments with growing concern. This was the people of Moab, a smaller and less powerful group. Their king, Balak, recognized the danger posed by the advancing Israelites. He understood that his forces were not strong enough to defeat them in open battle. Instead of preparing for war, he sought another method. Balak turned to a man named Balaam. Balaam was known as a figure associated with practices believed to influence events through spoken words and rituals. He is described as an Idumean or Midianite, meaning he was connected either to the people of Edom, also called Idumea, or to the Midianites, a group living in regions near the desert. Balaam's reputation rested on the belief that his pronouncements, especially curses, could bring harm or destruction upon individuals or entire nations. Balak requested that Balaam use his power to curse the Israelites. The intention was to weaken them without engaging them in battle. Balaam agreed to observe the situation. However, When he saw the encampment of the Israelites, something unexpected occurred. Instead of delivering curses, he spoke words of blessing. He declared that no form of enchantment or divination could prevail against the people called Jacob, another name for Israel. He spoke of a future in which they would prosper. Despite this, Balaam offered a different kind of advice. If direct harm could not be achieved through curses, he suggested another approach. He advised Balak to weaken the Israelites indirectly, by leading them into moral corruption. The method he proposed involved temptation, specifically through practices associated with certain religious rites. Balak accepted this plan. The Midianites, who had previously lived in peaceful contact with the Israelites, became the means through which this strategy was carried out. Because of their earlier friendly relations, the Israelites did not suspect danger when the Midianites entered their camps. Following the advice given, Midianite women were brought into the Israelite encampments. These women invited the Israelites to take part in ceremonies connected with the worship of a deity called Baal-peor. This deity was associated with local religious practices in the region. The ceremonies included actions that violated the moral and religious principles that the Israelites had received earlier at Mount Sinai. During these events, acts of moral misconduct were combined with acts of worship. Participation in these practices led many Israelites to abandon the discipline that had been expected of them. They joined in the feasts connected with these rituals and became involved in behavior that conflicted directly with the teachings they had been given. This situation posed a serious threat to the identity and stability of the people. The principles established at Sinai, which were meant to guide their conduct and distinguish them from other nations, were being undermined. Yet, at this critical moment, there was little immediate resistance from within the community. One individual, however, acted decisively. This was Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, who had been the brother of Moses and a leading figure among the Israelites. Phinehas saw one of the leaders of the tribe of Simon entering a tent with a Midianite woman, openly participating in the prohibited behavior. In response, Phinehas took direct action. He entered the tent and killed both individuals. This act was not random, but intended to stop what he saw as a spreading corruption. According to the tradition, a deadly outbreak, described as a plague, had begun among the people as a consequence of their actions. The intervention of Phinehas was believed to have halted this disaster. At the same time, another development was taking place among the Israelites, one that reflected a different aspect of their growth. Their recent victories and experiences gave rise to a new form of expression. They began to create songs, particularly songs that celebrated battle and success. This marked the beginning of a cultural development. The ability to compose and preserve such songs became an important element in the life of the people. Those who created these compositions, referred to as makers of sayings or poets, gained recognition. Their works were collected and remembered, forming part of a body of tradition that included accounts of conflicts and victories, such as those recorded in a collection known as the Book of the Wars of God. In its early form, this poetry was simple. It did not yet possess the depth or refinement that would come later. However, it showed certain patterns that would become characteristic. One of these was the use of balanced structure within each line, where thought would be expressed and then repeated with variation. Another feature was a tendency to present ideas in contrast, placing an ideal concept alongside a different, often opposing reality. Despite their successes, the Israelites could not remain indefinitely in the region they had conquered between the rivers called the Arnon and the Jabbok. Their goal lay beyond, across the Jordan. Preparations had to be made for this next stage. Yet, the victories over Sihon and another ruler named Og had created new complications. Two of the tribes, known as Reuben and Gad, approached Moses with a request. They observed that the land already taken was well suited for their way of life, particularly for raising livestock such as cattle and camels. They asked to remain in this territory rather than continue the journey. This request raised serious concerns. It suggested that these tribes might separate themselves from the rest of the people, choosing independence instead of unity. Moses reacted strongly, expressing his disapproval and concern. He feared that such a division could weaken the entire community. However, a compromise was reached. The tribes of Reuben and Gad were allowed to settle in the conquered land, but only under a condition. They were required to provide soldiers who would join the other tribes in the continued campaign across the Jordan. Only after fulfilling this obligation would they return to their own territory. This arrangement led to a division of land that had not been originally planned. The territory occupied by these tribes became known as the region beyond the Jordan, referred to as Transjordanic land, meaning land on the far side of the river. Over time, this decision would have consequences that were not entirely beneficial. As the remaining tribes prepared to cross the Jordan and move into the land they had long sought, an event occurred that brought a profound change. Moses, their leader, the one who had guided them from Egypt and through the wilderness, died. The people entered a period of mourning that lasted 30 days. This was not a formality, but a reflection of their loss. Moses had been central to every stage of their journey. His absence created a sense of emptiness. The people felt that something essential had been taken from them, and that no one could fully replace what they had lost. Among all those remembered in history as lawgivers, as founders of nations, and as teachers who sought to guide humanity, none was regarded as equal to Moses. His achievement stood apart. Under conditions that were difficult and uncertain, he took a scattered and oppressed group, a people reduced to slavery, and shaped them into a nation. This transformation was not limited to their outward condition. He gave them a lasting identity, something that would endure beyond his lifetime, as if he had placed within the people a spirit that would not perish. He set before them clear ideals, principles that were not optional but essential. Their well-being, their survival, and their future depended on whether they followed or rejected these ideals. In guiding them, Moses could compare his role to that of a father carrying a child, supporting and sustaining them through weakness and fear. His leadership was marked by qualities that did not often fail him. He showed patience in moments of unrest and courage in times of danger. He did not act out of personal gain. His unselfishness and his calm and humble nature allowed him to lead without seeking power for himself. Alongside these traits was what was described as a prophetic vision, an ability to perceive a direction and purpose beyond immediate circumstances. These qualities together made him fit to serve as an instrument of divine will. He did not guard his position with jealousy. Instead, he expressed the wish that all among the Israelites might share in the same spiritual insight, that they too might become prophets, and that the divine spirit might rest upon them as it had upon him. In later generations, Moses came to be seen as the highest example of what a prophet could be. Those who followed after him measured themselves against his life and found it beyond reach. The people of Israel took pride in the thought that such a figure had guided them in their earliest days, when they were newly formed as a nation. Even his death carried meaning. It was not marked by public display or by the creation of a shrine. In the land of Moab, in a valley facing Mount Pure, a place held sacred by the local inhabitants, Moses was buried quietly. The exact location of his burial was never revealed, and it remained unknown to all who came after. This concealment served a purpose. It prevented the people from turning his memory into an object of worship. Unlike other nations, which raised their rulers and heroes to the status of gods, or treated founders of religions as divine beings, the Israelites were to be kept from such practices. The passing of Moses left the people in sorrow. He had been their guide, their teacher, and their protector, yet he was not permitted to lead them into the land that had been promised to them. Despite this grief, they were not without strength. Their memory held powerful events, their release from slavery in Egypt, their passage through the waters of the Red Sea, and the giving of laws at Mount Sinai. These experiences remained with them as sources of encouragement. They were also strengthened by more recent victories. They had overcome Sihon, a ruler of the Amorites, and Og, another powerful king, as well as the people known as the Midianites. These successes gave them confidence as they approached the next stage of their journey. At a time described as a bright period of spring, the tribes of Israel reached and crossed the Jordan River. This crossing marked a movement into a new phase of their history. Leading them now was Joshua, the devoted follower and disciple of Moses, who took up the responsibility of guiding the people forward along the path that had been set before them.